when my mother slammed the legal envelope onto the mahogany dining table, demanding a formal DNA test on my 4-year-old son. She thought she had finally found the ultimate weapon to destroy me. She smirked, convinced she was stripping my boy of his inheritance and exposing a lie. What she didn't realize was that I didn't flinch for a single second. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Yes, let's do it today." She wanted to prove he wasn't part of her precious bloodline to keep him out of the family estate, but my instant agreement completely threw her off guard. She thought she was setting a trap for my family, unaware that I was entirely at peace. 3 weeks later, the laboratory called with the official results, but they didn't care about my son. They wanted to talk about the reference sample she had submitted as her own. My name is Emma, I'm 28 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned growing up in this sterling household, it's that money doesn't just buy comfort. It buys control. My mother, Evelyn, managed the family empire with an iron fist. She viewed every family member not as a relative, but as an asset or a liability. Ever since I gave birth to my 4-year-old son, Leo, she had treated him as the ultimate liability. It all came to a head on a crisp Tuesday evening during our mandatory family dinner at the estate. The dining room was suffocatingly quiet, filled only with the clinking of silver forks against fine china. My husband and I sat across from my older brother, while Evelyn sat at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating her usual icy authority. Without warning, she set her wine glass down and tapped a thick, white legal envelope against the table. The sharp sound cut through the room like a gunshot. "I'm making a permanent amendment to the estate trust tomorrow," Evelyn announced, her tone as dry as bone. "And, before a single dollar of the family fortune is allocated toward Leo's future, I require absolute proof." I set my napkin down, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "Proof of what, Mother?" "Proof that he belongs to this bloodline," she replied, a cruel, smug smile playing on her lips. "I won't have my father's legacy squandered on a child whose parentage might be questionable. I am demanding a formal, lab-certified DNA test on Leo to keep him in the will. If you refuse, he is completely written out as of 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." My brother gasped, and my husband shifted angrily in his seat, preparing to launch into a defense. But I held up a hand to stop him. Evelyn was watching me closely, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. She expected me to burst into tears, to scream, or to storm out in humiliation, anything that would make me look guilty and give her an excuse to cut us off forever. She thought she had constructed the ultimate trap. Instead, I looked her dead in the eye, didn't hesitate for a single second, and smiled right back at her. "Yes," I said smoothly, my voice ringing clear across the room. "Let's do it today. In fact, set up the appointment for first thing tomorrow morning." The smug expression on Evelyn's face faltered, just for a fraction of a second. She had spent weeks preparing for a fight, completely unprepared for the reality that I had absolutely nothing to hide. The next morning, we met at the genetic testing facility in downtown Chicago. The waiting room was sterile and silent, smelling faintly of antiseptic. Evelyn sat in a plush leather armchair, her arms crossed, looking more like an inspector general than a grandmother. She hadn't said a word to me since the night before, likely still unnerved by how easily I had agreed to her aggressive demands. When the nurse finally called us back, Evelyn stood up first, taking charge of the room as if she owned the medical practice. "I want to ensure there is zero chance of tampering or error," Evelyn declared, her voice cold and commanding. "I will be providing my own reference sample alongside my grandson's. I want a direct lineal match verified against my own profile." The nurse blinked, clearly taken aback by her harsh demeanor, but nodded politely and prepared 2 separate collection kits. I sat in the chair with 4-year-old Leo on my lap. He was fascinated by the colorful posters on the wall, completely oblivious to the cruel game his grandmother was trying to play. I gently held his chin while the technician rubbed the cotton swab against the inside of his cheek. Leo giggled, thinking it was a game, and I gave him a soft, reassuring squeeze. "See? All done, buddy," I whispered, kissing the top of his head. Next was Evelyn's turn. She sat rigidly in the chair, pulling out her golden pen to fill out the legal consent documents with precise, sharp strokes. She handed her completed paperwork back to the technician along with her swab, watching every single movement as the vials were sealed, barcoded, and placed into tamper-evident bags. She was obsessed with control, convinced that her meticulous oversight was going to trap me in a lie. What she failed to understand was why I had stayed so ridiculously calm through this entire ordeal. Evelyn had spent years trying to undermine me, constantly insinuating that my quiet lifestyle and ordinary husband made me weak. She believed her wealth gave her absolute authority over our lives, and she used the estate trust like a leash. But truth isn't something you can intimidate or buy off. I knew Leo was my son, and I knew my husband was his father. By demanding this test, Evelyn thought she was backing me into a corner, but in reality, she was the one handing over her own genetic signature to an independent laboratory. As we walked out to the parking lot, she gave me one last cold glare before stepping into her town car, completely unaware that she had just set her own trap in motion. The 3 weeks that followed were an exercise in psychological warfare. The family dynamic shifted instantly, splitting down the middle as word of the mandatory DNA test spread through our circle like wildfire. My mother didn't keep her actions quiet. In fact, she wore them like a badge of honor. She held small luncheons and made phone calls to distant aunts and uncles, framing her cruelty as a necessary measure to protect the family lineage and secure the estate. She wanted everyone to look at me with suspicion, hoping the isolation would force me to surrender before the results even arrived. Relatives began calling me under the guise of checking in, their subtle questions probing for any sign of panic. My sister-in-law awkwardly suggested that maybe I should just apologize to Evelyn to keep the peace, while an uncle hinted that fighting the matriarch was a battle I was guaranteed to lose. I listened politely, kept my responses short, and refused to offer them the drama they were desperately looking for. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't send angry text messages, and I certainly didn't beg my mother to call off the laboratory. Instead, I focused on my home. While Evelyn was busy playing political games with the family trust, I quietly prepared my own ground. I organized our personal documents, consulted with a trusted family law attorney off the record, and ensured that whatever move Evelyn made next, my husband, son, and I would be completely protected. I knew how my mother operated. She thrived on chaos and emotional reactions. By refusing to enter the arena, I left her shadowboxing against an opponent who simply wouldn't flinch. Every day that passed without a word from the facility only seemed to heighten Evelyn's impatience. She sent smug, passive-aggressive emails about upcoming schedule adjustments for the family trust meetings, clearly convinced that time was running out for my branch of the family. I read them, archived them, and went about my days making breakfast for Leo, taking him to the park, and living our life normally. I was entirely at peace because I knew the truth was already sitting in a sterile laboratory, waiting to be printed on official letterhead. The waiting period wasn't breaking me. It was slowly consuming her, as she waited for a breakdown that was never going to come. On a rainy Thursday morning, 21 days after our visit to the clinic, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed the name of the genetic laboratory. I answered expecting an automated notification or a standard digital report sent to my email, but the voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Marcus Vance, the regional director of testing operations himself. His tone wasn't corporate or routine. It was measured, guarded, and distinctly uneasy. "Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, verifying my identity before continuing. "I am calling regarding the comparative genetic analysis requested for your household. Usually, these results are uploaded directly to your secure client portal, but due to severe regulatory protocols and flagged discrepancies in our national registry, I am required to speak with you directly before releasing the paperwork." My heart gave a sudden, deliberate thump, though not out of fear. "Is there a problem with my son's sample?" I asked calmly, wiping down the table with a hand towel. "No, Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Vance replied, pausing to clear his throat. "Your son, Leo, is unequivocally your biological child, and his markers align perfectly with standard maternal lineage. That part of the testing is entirely clear and undisputed. The issue we encountered, and the reason this file was escalated to our legal compliance division, pertains directly to the reference sample provided by your mother, Evelyn Sterling." I sat down in the nearest chair, holding the receiver tightly to my ear. What about her sample? When a client submits a reference sample for formal estate verification, our system automatically runs the profile through national hereditary and identity databases to establish clear lineage, Dr. Vance explained, his voice dropping an octave. When we process the DNA from the swab your mother submitted as her own, the system threw a critical error. The genetic profile from that swab does not match the public identity, birth records, or family registry of Evelyn Sterling. I froze, digesting his words. What are you saying? I'm saying the woman who submitted that DNA sample is biologically related to your son as a grandmother, but she is legally and genetically not Evelyn Sterling, Dr. Vance said flatly. Furthermore, her specific genetic markers triggered an automatic flag in our system linked to an open inheritance fraud case dating back 34 years. We didn't call to discuss your son, Mrs. Sterling. We called because the woman claiming to own your family estate is using a completely stolen identity. Within an hour of hanging up with Dr. Vance, I was sitting in the private office of Arthur Pendleton, a veteran estate litigator who had worked independently of my family for decades. I handed him the sealed, flagged report from the laboratory, along with a mountain of older family public records I had pulled from my father's old filing cabinets years ago. Together, we began piece by piece tracing the ghost trail that the DNA test had accidentally ripped wide open. What we uncovered over the next 48 hours was a calculated deception so massive it made my mother's petty trust fund games look utterly amateur. The real Evelyn Sterling, my father's original, wealthy heiress wife, had passed away quietly in a private European clinic over 35 years ago. The woman sitting in our family estate, calling herself Evelyn and wielding absolute control over a $100 million empire, was actually her estranged half-sister, Victoria. When the real Evelyn died, Victoria had systematically stepped into her sister's life, utilizing forged legal documents, offshore account signatures, and bribed estate administrators to assume the Sterling identity before the estate was legally settled. She had spent the last 3 decades hoarding a fortune that was never rightfully hers, terrified that any official biological verification across generations would expose the fact that her genetic markers didn't match the original Sterling legacy. She had used the DNA test as a weapon to intimidate me, operating under the arrogant assumption that I would refuse the swab out of pride or fear. She thought her authority was so absolute that no one would ever dare run her reference sample through a national database. By trying to cast doubt on my 4-year-old son to protect her stolen fortune, she had unwittingly submitted her own fraudulent identity directly into an automated federal verification system, handing us the exact legal lever needed to dismantle her fake empire forever. On Friday afternoon, I summoned the entire family and the estate's corporate legal team to the grand boardroom at the Sterling headquarters. The pretext was simple. We were gathering for the formal reading of the DNA test results that would supposedly determine my son's future. Victoria, still posing as my mother, Evelyn, sat at the head of the long table, wearing a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the ruthless matriarch ready to claim her victory. She adjusted her pearls and tapped the mahogany table, looking directly at me with that familiar, icy condescension. "I hope you've prepared yourself, Emma," she said smoothly, her voice echoing in the silent room. "Actions have consequences, and today we put an end to the doubts regarding this estate." "I couldn't agree more," I replied, standing up and opening my leather briefcase. Instead of pulling out a standard paternity document, I placed a thick stack of certified legal briefs and federal compliance forms in front of every board member and family relative at the table. Victoria's smug expression began to waver as Arthur Pendleton stood up beside me, pulling an official court summons from his jacket. "The DNA results for 4-year-old Leo are completely conclusive," I announced, my voice echoing with unwavering authority across the silent room. "He is my biological son, and his lineage is verified." However, the control sample provided by the woman sitting at the head of this table triggered a federal identity fraud flag. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the room. Victoria's face went completely drained of color, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the armrests of her chair. 35 years ago, the real Evelyn Sterling passed away, I continued, looking her directly in the eye. "And you, Victoria, stepped into her life, stole her name, and commandeered an entire family empire built on a lie. You tried to test my son's blood to protect a fortune that was never yours, but all you did was hand the lab the exact proof needed to tear down your fake authority forever. The aftermath of that boardroom confrontation was swift and uncompromising. With the forensic genetic evidence and paper trail laid bare, the board immediately stripped Victoria of all executive power and froze the accounts she had spent decades manipulating. Federal authorities stepped in to handle the identity fraud, leaving her facing the absolute destruction of her reputation and the total forfeiture of her assets. The half-sister, who had spent 35 years living a gilded lie, was forced to watch her carefully constructed empire dissolve overnight, completely ruined by the very test she had demanded to humiliate my son. With the legal chaos settled, the true estate was restructured according to my father's original, uncorrupted wishes. The fortune was placed into a secure trust managed by independent fiduciaries, ensuring that Leo and future generations were protected from any further greed or manipulation. More importantly, the toxic shadow that had hung over our family for decades was finally lifted. We walked away from the endless power games, choosing a life built on actual integrity rather than forced obedience and wealth. Today, our home is filled with genuine peace. Leo grows up knowing he is loved unconditionally, free from the burdens of a family legacy that tried to define his worth through cruelty. Standing up to my mother, or the woman who claimed to be my mother, didn't just protect my son's future, it freed me from a cage of fear I had lived in since childhood. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface, and living honestly turned out to be the greatest inheritance I could ever give my family.